Hi, this is Brett King, the host of Breaking Banks, and I want to tell you about the brand new book Richard Petty and I have coming out in November called The Rise of Technosocialism. Feel free to check out www.riseoftechnosocialism.com for more information on the book and where you can get your copy. I'd be very grateful for your support and consideration of this new book, The Rise of Technosocialism. Welcome to Breaking Banks.
Welcome back to Breaking Banks. I'm Amber Buker, and I cannot wait to dig into this conversation today with two very special guests. We're joined by our very own Brett King. He's a tech founder, podcast host, author, futurist, probably a half dozen other titles. But today, Brett's here to talk about his latest book, The Rise of Technosocialism. And to round out the discussion, we're joined by the eminent slinger of Snark, Mr. Ron Shevlin. Ron is the director of research for Cornerstone Advisors and writes a regular column for Forbes called the Fintech Snark Tank, in case you've been living under a rock and didn't know that yet. And in that blog for Forbes, Ron recently reviewed Brett's book. So Brett, Ron, thank you both for joining us. How's it going?
It's going great.
Doing great.
Thank you both for it's a bit weird to be on the other side of the microphone.
I was thinking the same thing, Amber. I was thinking, I've been a guest on Breaking Banks. I've guest hosted Breaking Banks, but never had a chance to actually talk to Brett on Breaking Banks.
There you go. We're breaking new ground with Breaking Banks. So, yeah.
Don't worry, guys. Let's try to go easy on you. No, it was a great book, really interesting read, and love the opportunity to get my hands on it first. In the book, Brett, you basically posit 4 possible outcomes for the future, which is fitting since you are a self-proclaimed futurist. 3 out of the 4 are really bleak. They describe a future that has high levels of chaos and inequality, but the 4th is not so bleak. It's called technosocialism. So can you help us understand exactly what that is, Brett?
Sure. So I think the way to think about this really is, what is, I use the term in the book liberally, which is optimal humanity. What is the best configuration for human society so that as many people as possible can succeed and be prosperous, that's really an economic goal more than anything else. But I guess the difference between technosocialism and what you would normally call socialism is in the area of socialism, we talk about workers owning the means of production, right? And that's sort of a core economic framework for that. But in technosocialism, we talk fundamentally about the role of work itself changing. So it's more about citizens owning the economy, or the economy prioritized around citizens first and foremost. Because if you look at the challenges we have coming up, obviously we've got inequality. If you live in the United States, we have the highest inequality in the history of the nation, and that's a problem we have to solve. That's been accentuated by the pandemic, and it's also going to be accentuated by the introduction of artificial intelligence, which results in techno unemployment, and of course by climate change. So in all of these, potential futures that we talk about, the average citizen is obviously going to have greater and greater difficulties being a part of the economy, and so. How do you get the economy working optimally for the citizens is really the economic theory of technosocialism. But from a philosophical perspective, it's that humanity is at our best when we work together, and that technology will enable us to do that in very different ways over the future and solve problems that we think are unsolvable today, like, who's going to pay for universal health care and things like that, as an example.
So, Brett, let me just jump in and ask to clarify, because first of all, let me tell you, I've read all your books, I think except for one, the branch one or whatever, but Bank 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, Augmented, love them all. And I think this is really your most important book to date, for sure. But I'll be honest, I wrestled a bit with coming away with getting a clear view of what techno-socialism was. And as I kind of grapple with that and listen to your explanation, can't help but wonder, are you referring to like techno-governance? Because, obviously the socialist word either, appeals to some people or doesn't. I get your definition, but it seems to me like what you're advocating for is the role of technology in governing, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but in a positive sense.
Look, that's definitely part of it. I mean, Ron, we talked about this book probably 2 years ago as I was writing this, and the name, was a cause for concern for many of the people I spoke to. They said it's going to be divisive. Certain people are just going to right away see that title and and be pushed away from it. But we experimented with so many different potential terms of describing this. So we one of the titles we looked at was like the rise of optimal humanity. We looked at techno-humanism, techno-collectivism, these different terms that could create this. And I'll say, we chose the term technosocialism with purpose because we wanted a reaction, a visceral reaction. We wanted people to say, "Oh, I got to, I've got to prove this wrong," right? And so we wanted the debate. And so, in many ways, technosocialism may not be the most accurate title in terms of describing what's in the book, but then we think it was the best match because it more is a philosophical approach. And if you put aside the economic issues of socialism and how it's perceived as in competition with capitalism, socialism was trying to solve the problem of inequality, right? In many respects, but it wasn't functionally really able to do that. There's very few examples of where pure socialism actually worked effectively. Having said that, when you throw in technology, then we think that a lot of the problems that socialism was trying to solve, we can address over the longer term because we simply reduce the cost of government, we make government more effective, and we make the economy work better for the collective humanity that it's supposed to serve. And that often came up as sort of a key question in the book is what is the purpose of the economy? Is it to serve a very small group of, the richest citizens, or is it there to serve everybody? And if it's there to serve everybody, then, economically, a lot of markets you'd have to say are a failure in respect to that intent. And so it may not be the perfect title, but it's a title that we hope will get people talking. And that was ultimately, how we're trying to use it.
It's interesting that this is really kind of a high-minded philosophical debate that you're looking to pull out of folks when there are so many pieces in the book where you've got kind of graphs and charts with labels and dichotomies. I know that that's one of the things that Ron talked about in his review of the book, was some of those dichotomies and labels might present a bit of a simplistic view of the factors at play here. So Ron, how are you thinking about the book? Is it primarily useful as a thought exercise, or how would you recommend kind of looking at those pieces?
Yeah, I think I think maybe Amber, before I address that, let's ask Brett to describe the outcomes, because I think those four things are very key, and then I'll get into sort of what my reaction to that was.
Great. Yeah, I'd be interested in that too. So obviously what started this off was the view of inequality, and we had to rewrite, significant portions of the book during the pandemic because the pandemic really gave us a lot more data to work with in respect to inequality and how inequality could get worse fairly quickly, with these crises. And so inequality had to be a core part of it. So, we've got this magic quadrant of the four outcomes. And so inequality is the first axis. So if at one end you have inequality, your other end, you have equality or inclusiveness, more significantly. And so when you look at that as a spectrum, from a political philosophy at least, you're looking at economies that prioritize the whole versus individuals, right? And so when you like, you could look at Europe tends to be more collective in its policy setting, whereas the US tends to be more individualistic and emphasizing the individual. So they're two examples of that spectrum. The other spectrum was just whether we want ordered, an ordered transition to this future through these crises, or whether we are going to keep arguing about that and, get to this point where, the chaos ramps up before we have to address it. So chaotic versus planned, or you might call it in classic science fiction terms, dystopian versus utopian. And so that's how we mapped out these 4 quadrants. And so on the failed side, on the chaotic side, you have 2 scenarios that are most likely outcomes. One is where you have failed states because we just waited too long. So think about, say, Bangladesh or the Maldives, both that are at significant threat of rising sea levels, where 80% of their infrastructure and land mass is going to be affected by sea rise. If we wait too long, we have failed states. Then we have rejection of technology, primarily around artificial intelligence, because of its displacement of humans from the workforce, and rejection of science more broadly, which we, it sounds a little far-fetched, but we see with the anti-vaxxer movement and things like that, in sort of broad distrust of science and technology. We see it with Facebook, in respect to people's perception of Facebook's role in society. And then you have the planned outcomes. So of the planned outcomes, you have 2. One, which is optimal for everybody and is planned in terms of as inclusive as possible. And then more exclusionary planned outcomes, where you have the rich get richer, the poor get the picture, as we say in the book, which is actually a line from a Midnight Oil song. You can tell I'm Australian. But where inequality sort of gets baked in more permanently through policy. So we saw those as the 4 possible outcomes. Now, there were a couple of others that we could have put if we configured that graph a slightly different way. But ultimately, the really significant point was, is there something that is, inclusive and positive for humanity broadly? Or are there, is the problem of inequality and the chaotic problem of, just waiting too long to do stuff, was that going to dominate our future? And that's really what the book is trying to get at. That if we want an optimal future, we have to sort of change philosophically the way we think about other humans in the mix.
So thanks, Brett, for doing that. So let me share with you kind of what my reaction to that was and see how you respond. I felt it was a little bit of an artificial distinction between these categories, and that I didn't think that there's an all or nothing here. There seems to me that we can be in shades of gray, and that we can be in any particular society within the global environment can be in multiple camps at the same time. So, for example, I thought China was a good example. Highly automated in the the trait of the technosocialism quadrant, but I would think fairly general autocratic rule, a trait of I think it was the fail-distan quadrant. So Sure. It felt to me like, while you were painting the picture, which I think is very helpful for the 4 things, it's like, where are we at any point in time is probably some combination of all 4. And, I always feel like that there's a lot of people who just, kind of want to get to this nirvana state in a one jump thing. And we just don't ever get there.
Society just doesn't work like that, right? And so society is messy and chaotic by its nature. And you're absolutely right. We are going to see all 4 of these cases simultaneously over the next 30 years. I guess the point of this discussion was, if you're aware of the outcomes of each of these different approaches, then we hope that incentivizes us to say, no, we should choose the optimal configuration for humanity, that all of these other outcomes, if we continue to debate them or allow them, that that's not the optimal outcome. And at its heart, I guess the book is really about policy reform and economic reform, and using these arguments as a kickoff for making changes that help us have more cohesive societies. The problem that we've seen in recent times is social cohesion gets very problematic when you have failures in policy, when you have division around inequality, and so again, philosophically, the argument is humanity is at its best when we work together. And of those four outcomes, technosocialism does tend to lead to a more cooperative, collaborative sort of viewpoint. But you're right. We are going to see all four of these scenarios play out simultaneously over the next 30 years.
So, Brett, let me ask you one other thing, because you've referred to the term equality many times just in the past 5-10 minutes already. And hearing that, and also through reading the book, I couldn't help but wonder, if you were really referring to equity or inequity versus inequality. And let me read you this definition. I pulled this off of a website. It's some medical journal. And I'm going to kind of generalize it a little bit, because it's talking in terms of healthcare, but I think it applies in a more generic sense. It says, inequity and inequality, these terms are sometimes confused, but are not interchangeable. Inequity refers to unfair, unavoidable differences arising from poor governance, corruption, or cultural exclusion, while inequality refers to the uneven distribution of resources as a result of genetic or other factors of the lack of resources. And I can't help but feel that from what I've read in the book and from what you are saying, that you're really talking more about inequity versus inequality.
No, I think where we talk about the system being broken, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is inequity. But when you look at the solution set, it often does come down to resource allocation and prioritization of resources. And when you look at the gap between the rich and the poor, in markets like the US, you could argue that that's inequality is an economic viewpoint of lack of availability or poor distribution of resources. And so the example we use in the book is that the post-Second World War US economy was the greatest economy the world has ever seen. But part of the reason for that was this wealth sort of bell curve of distribution of wages and wealth, in the 1950s and 1960s. That led to incredible growth in consumption and so forth. So if that's a resource allocation issue, resource allocation being wealth. And so if we can and China, one of the reasons their economy is growing is they have that strong middle class, wage growth. And in the 1980s, the US sort of froze, and the UK froze wage growth. We haven't seen significant wage growth in the 1980s, but the prices have gone up, like especially right now with inflation. And so the inequality of income, sort of leads to inequity. So I think the two are very closely linked. I don't think they're mutually exclusive in that respect. But we attack the resource allocation problem, using technology to reduce the cost of resource allocation or make resource allocation more efficient so that we get more of that bell curve distribution again, rather than, what we have today. So in pure economic terms, the more evenly wealth is distributed, the more healthy an economy is, and the more prosperous it is for everyone, right? That's the core argument.
So this kind of goes to one of the discussions in the book was talking about how technology will make resource allocation more efficient, make the government more efficient, and therefore folks may not try to push back against that if we're getting to this more equitable and equal outcome. But I'd like to push back against that a little bit, because you also talked about Will Durant, who is a great historian, who notes that every time we become closer to a diamond-shaped
Right.
economic model, diamond shape meaning that there's a large middle class and very small lower class and very small kind of ruling wealth class. The small ruling wealth class begins to try to outmaneuver and use their influence to regain more of that power that they potentially lost. So where does that leave us if our human nature is going to keep us fighting against that equality to some respect?
Look, I think Ron made a very good point in his article on Forbes, is that when we talk about these political divisions, they're artificial creations, right? And there's a when we get people fighting against each other, then it's a distraction from the problem, which is one of the tools that the wealthy elite have used in the past. They've sort of created these arbitrary or abstracted divisions, and that get us fighting so that they can capture the wealth. But having said that, the two future state problems, the impact of artificial intelligence and the impact of climate change, those are things that ultimately that sort of culture of division won't work, and it'll become fairly clear at some point in time, we think, where we need to have collective approaches. Like we say, there's no such thing as national climate change policy, because if the US is doing everything right in climate, in respect to climate mitigation, reducing carbon output and so forth, but China's building 100 new coal plants next year, then we can't fix the problem. So ultimately, at some point, it may have to get a lot worse. Human society is going to say, that's it, we have to work together. And at that point, I think that philosophical shift solves many of the problems that we have. But if I think the pyramid-shaped scenario, that's allowed to exist because of a couple of things. One is lack of transparency, so that a lot of the control mechanisms that the wealthy elite use to control economies, I think those are becoming more transparent, and so we're going to get clearer pushback. And I think that the sort of artificial division that allows that to occur and changes our focus away from that, it becomes less and less palatable in the future. But you're right, historically, diamond-shaped economies are unstable. Hopefully, we can sort of change that mix, through technology and transparency.
So is it your argument then, Brett, that we are on the precipice of changing essentially the course of history? If those diamond-shaped economies haven't worked up to this point, what kind of tipping point, what kind of inflection point are we at now that makes this time different?
Well, the AI thing and the role of work is sort of really core here, because if you think about the last 300 years with capitalism, Adam Smith, wealth of nations, supply and demand, the assumption always is that a highly functioning society will provide 100% or full employment. And so the whole basis of economic theory and supply and demand, there's debates around what full employment means and how that affects society. Friedman had a very different view of that to Adam Smith, for example, and Thomas Piketty has a very different view from Friedman. But it's that, how effectively does that production mechanism in society work to ensure everyone has a living wage and can survive? But artificial intelligence is designed to take humans out of the labor market. Now, in the medium term, that's going to require lots of skill set changes. So people involved in human sort of process-oriented jobs, factory workers and things like that, let's say they're all automated out by technology. But so the argument will be, we need to train them for the jobs that AI will create. But ultimately, the goal of AI is to eliminate human labor from the economy. So at some point in time, supply and demand no longer equates to more jobs. It equates to less and less jobs. And that's a fundamental problem for the philosophy around human society. If you don't work, you don't get paid, you don't survive, right? And yet, that we come to a point where you just can't work, there's not enough jobs for humans for you to work anymore, then what does economic theory tell us about how to deal with those individuals? And that's really the key problem.
Brett, I'm kind of surprised to hear you say this for a couple of reasons. First, historically, this doesn't sound like a totally different argument than what might have been argued back in the Industrial Revolution, where,
Sure.
okay, we're going to have automation and it's going to put all these people out of business and out of work, and it didn't. I'm also kind
Unless
of
you worked
surprised.
in farming,
But
which went from 80% of the American population was
But
farm.
there was a shift, and it took some time, and there's some, a period of disruption. But then, look what happened in the next 150 years. And so, just like you say, there are inflection points. But the other reason I'm kind of surprised to hear you say this is, you laid out, I think, some really cool theses in your book, Augmented. That it was about augmenting the humans, not replacing them, which is why I'm kind of surprised to hear you kind of arguing the elimination aspect of this versus the augmentation aspect of this.
Well, just like the Industrial Revolution, the elimination of humans from the workforce is going to take a extended period of time, many decades, maybe a century or more. But certainly by the middle of this century, by 2050, both in there's going to be clear disruption in terms of working patterns. The one saving grace, ironically, is if we didn't have climate change, then the labor force reductions would be far more severe than with climate change, because climate itself, our response to climate planet-wide, is going to require massive industrialization, and massive response. So we're talking about building, seawall defenses around New York and Miami. We're talking about carbon sequestration or extraction programs. We're talking about rebuilding the energy grid so it works with batteries and solar and wind instead of coal. All of these aspects will create a ton of work. But the question is, can capitalism and the free market create those jobs in respect to like mitigating climate change? But that's it's actually more of a governance problem, as you said earlier. It comes back to the fact that, well, this will require all of the governments of the world to agree on how this should happen, to figure out how to fund it. It's the scale of the climate problem is too big for capitalism to fix on its own. Like, what's the economic incentive of extracting carbon out of the atmosphere? Well, if you think of this in terms of VC investment or something like that, the payoff on investing in carbon extraction technology is just so far down the track that it becomes sort of non-viable from an investment thesis perspective. So you have to but we still have to do it, right? And so then the question is, how does that get paid for? We propose various solutions to that, forgiveness of national debt, so that can be used to fund that. But ultimately, it's sort of a regearing of, the economy, where a high percentage of GDP was redirected into making sure that the planet remains livable, right? But it's not. Capitalism can't come up with that on its own. It has to be sort of come out of human will.
You said these changes take place over time, but in the book, I was terrified when I read that a lot of these big shifts in the workforce are going to happen in the next 30 years. So before I'm even ready to retire. So that seems to be coming up actually a lot quicker than one might think. You talk about other inflection points kind of along this journey to this future state. And the back of the book actually has some really cool timelines for these kind of potential futures. What are some of the inflection points, some of the big headline inflection points that we should be looking out for?
So one of them obviously is as we start to see techno unemployment increasing. And we talk about in the book there's going to be both labor shortages and unemployment around AI because we're not training our kids for the jobs of the future in that respect. So we've got a misalignment in terms of education. But one is our response to AI. So if AI produces high level of unemployment, would there be certain societies where AI would be constrained or banned because of the labor force effect? That's one potential inflection point.
And that's kind of along the Luddistan,
Right,
similar,
right,
like the word Luddite, right? People
right.
that
Well,
reject technology.
exactly. Where we prioritize humans over the tech, right? Or we tax corporations so heavily for automating society that it slows down the implementation of technology more broadly. Another inflection point is China US relations. That's going to be we see it's important right now. We have Russia doing crazy stuff like blowing up satellites in space and things at the moment. It's China-US relations, are from a geopolitical perspective, I think more important and impactful. Where as China becomes the dominant economy in the world, philosophically, I think for many American economists and supporters of the pure form of capitalism we see in the US, I think are going to find that very difficult to grasp. And so would the US respond with sanctions against China? Could they get the rest of the world to support that? Would there be a military action to sort of try and hold China at bay economically? These are very concerning potential scenarios, but are not unbelievable. And so the China-US relationship and where that goes is one of those inflection points. As techno unemployment starts to hit, and we see more of a need for a social safety net, universal basic income primarily, all the entrepreneurs that we put in the book, they all say UBI is going to be necessary. Elon Musk talks about it frequently. Bill Gates has talked about it. He's talked about taxing robots as a way to pay for UBI. Bezos talks about it. So these entrepreneurs, I think they're trying to automate the economy. They can see the need for UBI, but there could be, for example, in the US, broad rejection of that as a scenario. And what pressure would that put on social cohesion? Well, when you've got very high unemployment rates, particularly youth unemployment, because the education mismatch, that's going to result in social unrest. So it was sort of like, that's one of those binary choices again. It's like you either have UBI or you have social unrest. You can't stop social unrest from happening in high unemployment scenarios unless you have a safety net. So again, that's a really key inflection point if we can get around the problem of who's going to pay for UBI as employment patterns change. So there are a few of those really critical inflection points which clearly take us down specific paths, in terms of our future. And that we sort of tried to describe what would be the outcome if we chose those specific paths.
You talked about AI and the ultimate purpose of AI essentially being to take us out of the workforce. A similar kind of theme that you talked about in the book was the world of crypto, blockchain, and DeFi, which arguably the role of those mechanisms is to take banks and other financial intermediaries out of the equation when it comes to the financial system. This was something that Ron talked about in his review of the book, and obviously the podcast is Breaking Banks, so I want to make sure that we touch on that. How do those elements feed into the rise of technosocialism, and what does that mean for TradFi?
TradFi, yes.
Traditional
TradFi
finance.
I know, no, I like that. I haven't heard it called TradFi before, but that makes
DeFi,
perfect sense.
TradFi.
It makes perfect sense.
CFI, centralized finance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is sort of, again, sort of a functional element of the economy right now. But one of the key things that sort of emerges, particularly in societies where you have things like universal basic income, is you'll have different prioritization, right? When people don't have to work to put food on the table, if you take that constraint away from them, then people can pursue much more sort of collective passion projects and things like that. So I think we'll see a lot of people aligning, for example, around choosing platforms, choosing communities where cryptocurrencies that are, very focused on low carbon output, or very focused on fixing some of the ecological problems produced by climate change, or providing solutions in that respect, where they may choose new types of currencies or new types of investment and deployment of their financial resources that fit more with their view of the world, their worldview. And so this has to result in more experimentation, more decentralization, more sort of groups of or collectives, coming together with these sort of mission-based things, where they sort of design currencies and they design these tokens to operate to fit their worldview. So I think there's more potential than ever for DeFi that comes out of sort of the chaos and people trying different things in this scenario, for sure. In terms of the banks, banks are going to have to change. Banks are going to have to become good corporate citizens. We see protests happening in the UK right now against Barclays and HSBC because of their fossil fuel position. We see the same, we see Goldman Sachs saying, we're still going to do fossil fuels in recent times in the US. I think every corporation is going to be judged by different measures just than the stock market returns or their share price and their profits. I think they're going to be assessed by whether they're good corporate citizens, and I think there's going to be a lot of transparency around that. And I think people will choose to move away from TradFi, where they don't change their behavior to be, better corporate citizens.
So Brent, I guess, somebody could argue with me on this, that my view that I tend to think of these things more in evolutionary timeframes than in terms of points, endpoints. You look at the past 40, 50 years in the US from a political perspective, and we go back and forth between, Democrats and Republicans, and from, conservative to liberal, and, it goes kind of back and forth as we kind of meander along. So what's post technosocialism? What comes after that?
Oh, really interesting. Well, the big change in government and governance in particular, at a national and local level, is one about making sure that the money that the government has is optimally allocated from a resource allocation perspective. So we actually think that representative government will disappear, right? In terms of individual members of parliament or individual members of the Senate and Congress making decisions on which laws will be put into place or how the budget will be allocated, that increasingly that just becomes algorithm based or highly automated, and the consensus building around policy has the potential to become real time, and we argue for a consensus based mechanism around governance in the book that's quite radically different from today, where if you're looking at specific laws, that you have to have domain expertise in those areas, et cetera. So we use the example of virtual Taiwan and the stateship analogy from Socrates and things like that. So ultimately, government becomes just a mechanism of administration over the tools that we use for resource allocation, rather than the sort of voting mechanisms that we have today. It tends to function much more in real time, So that's from a governance perspective at a local level. At a global level, certain things make sense to be global governance. So, things like regulation of artificial intelligence, regulation around gene therapy, regulation of augmenting humans, transhumanism. The ethics around having cyber implants and these sorts of things. So I think we're going to end up with more sensible sort of global regulations around that, with some consensus-based mechanisms across national boundaries. But that's purely because, just think about AI. Today, we're using Chinese AI all the time. If you use TikTok as an app, you're using Chinese AI. Anyone that's using Facebook is using American AI, around the world. And we've seen, Facebook's AI has produced some pretty drastic effects, right, in certain countries. And so ultimately, AI, it doesn't make sense to just regulate AI at a local level. It doesn't make sense to regulate carbon output at a local level. It needs to be done, across the globe. So that's the sort of post technosocialism governance that comes about. I'm not saying a global government, but we are saying global governance, which is it will be a more efficient mechanism.
So basically, government becomes a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization.
Absolutely. Yes.
I got another question for you, Brett. But before I do that, I imagine most people listening to this are listening to the podcast and don't see the video. And what most people are missing is that in this discussion of techno-socialism, people are not seeing that Amber is drinking her coffee from a Feel the Burn mug.
Feel the burn.
The Bernie Sanders Feel the Burn. Boy, you really got into it today, didn't you? Into the spirit, huh?
I paid $8 whole for that mug. I show it off every chance I get.
Well, Amber also suggests I send the book to Bernie, so that's probably a good idea. Actually.
Yeah,
that's a great idea.
We got to get him on the line for sure. See what he thinks of all this.
So, Brett, I wanted to share another thought with you. There's something that kind of kept running through my head as I was reading through the book. And to set up this comment, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Tom Robbins, some of his books. I think there was a line in one of his books I've always remembered. I think it was the book Still Life with Woodpecker, where one of the characters says, there are two types of people in this world. Those who think there are two types of people in this world, and those of us who know better. Right. And the reason that came to mind is because there was a study that I read from a few years ago, which said people were either technology optimists or technology pessimists. And Brett, I've known you for more than 10 years now. I've read a lot of what you've written.
Yeah,
I've talked to you a lot. You are a technology optimist. I'm not a technology pessimist. Those are the Luddistans and so forth. I mean, but there's you're a
techno skeptic.
I'm a techno realist. I'm but forget what I am. My view from reading the book, what kept hitting me was that you have this technology optimist view.
Yeah.
But there are so many non-technology optimists, whether they're skeptics or pessimists. And how do you overcome this distinction in human nature?
Well, part of it is that if you look over the last few hundred years, that technology always wins, right? Whether you're optimistic about it or whether you're a realist or a skeptic, technology's march is relentless. And we don't have very many examples at all that where technology is stopped because it's seen as having a deleterious effect on the community, right?
But Brett, I don't think that's the dichotomy. The dichotomy is, and social media is a great example. Man, you go back 15 years and there were so many people saying, oh, social media is going to, democratize everything and give everybody a voice. And you roll the clock forward 15 years, and there's probably nothing more evil on this planet than some of the big tech social media.
True.
So it's not the whether technology wins or not. Yeah. It's the realistic view that there are always these unintended negative consequences from what we tend to believe as having a positive impact. And that's why I thought in the book, I said, you're just not allowing enough for the unintended impacts and consequences of this.
You know what? I think you're absolutely right. I think that, I am a techno-optimist, and I think we can solve all these problems with the smart application of these technologies, but we've shown our tendency to misuse these technologies. Certainly, technology of late has been used to create far greater divisions around things like COVID vaccines. I mean, in the face of some of that evidence, maybe I should be a little bit more pessimistic or skeptical about some of this. But, one of the things that makes a futurist is we're in a hurry to get to the future, and we see technology as the gateway for that. And so when we describe the future of humanity in the way we do, sort of optimal humanity, we describe that with an optimistic view of the use of technology to get us there. But when we look at things like AI, if we don't have an ethical approach to this, well, I mean, look at what Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk have said about sort of runaway artificial intelligence as an example, where we don't think about that. The potential for the risk to humanity is significant. And so I think we're going to have to get better at sort of managing that for sure. But yeah, overall, I'm pretty optimistic. I know we got to wrap it up, but overall, I think ultimately it technology can be used for the good of all rather than just a select few, and that's I think that's going to become increasingly necessary.
One last question before we wrap it up. I love ending on an optimistic note, but I'm very curious. You mentioned that you had to edit a lot of the book because of the pandemic. It certainly actually added a ton to your argument for technosocialism, the pandemic. I'm very curious what you edited out of the final version of the book, which is going to drop on Sunday, correct?
Yeah. Yes, correct.
Okay. Yeah. So what did you have to edit out?
So I'll just give you an example. When the book started, we described the issue of homelessness we talked about Skid Row in LA, the fact that the Black Plague was coming back because of the rats in Skid Row. We talked about the cage homes in Hong Kong and things like this. And we were describing sort of some of the social problems created by inequality. But it was a pretty dark way to open the book. So instead, the pandemic allowed us to talk about the fact that, there was a delayed response in respect to sort of pure capitalism and pure market forces in correcting the issues. And, ultimately, like stimulus payments gave a great example of how we might implement UBI. And so, there were a lot of examples that sort of came out. But the pandemic really accentuated the inequality argument. And so that was, whenever we talked about inequality, we now had new data to put against that throughout the book. But I think, I do think that the pandemic probably provided us with a ton more evidence to support our core argument that inequality was unsustainable.
Perfect. Well, I think we've gone all around the world and back again. Thank you so much for coming on, Brett.
Thank you all. For those of you who are listening, I appreciate your support of Breaking Banks in the book, and Amber and Ron, thanks for putting me on the other side of the microphone.
Yeah.
That's it for this week. If you like the show, make sure to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, or share it with a friend, or share it on social media.
We'll see you again next week with more Breaking Banks.